Hi, I'm Walter D. Donnie Kennedy, Chief of Heritage Operations for the Sons of Confederate Veterans, and we're here today to talk about the Battle of Fort Pillow. And I have with me here Dr. Samuel Mitchum, the author of Bust Hell Wide Open, The Life of Nathan Bedford Forrest. This is Dr. Samuel W. Mitchum, Jr., as it says on your books, Dr. Mitchum, and we're glad to have you here. You are our resident expert on Forrest. As a matter of fact, Dr. Mitchum is our heritage historian for our heritage operation and has been a valuable help guiding us and helping us on historical matters. So we want to talk about the Battle of Fort Pillow. And a lot of people have referred to this, Dr. Mitchum, as the massacre at Fort Pillow. Is that correct?
No, it wasn't. There were about 600 Union troops involved. 300 were killed. And a massacre, military terms mean things. And a massacre is when everyone or almost everyone gets killed, like Thermopylae or the Alamo or Custer's Last Stand.
Yes.
There was no massacre at Fort Pillow. There may have been an atrocity.
Yes.
But no, it did not fit the military definition of a
in
massacre.
that case, I'm going to refer to this as the Battle of Fort Pillow then, if that's okay.
Be more appropriate.
There you go. I want to ask the first question I want to ask, what was the reason, what stimulated Forrest to attack this little isolated fort on the Mississippi River?
Chivalry.
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 Tell us what is chivalry?
It's behaving in a civilized manner, even in war.
Even in war.
Fort Pillow had no military value. It was built by the Confederates. As a matter of fact, it was named after Confederate General Gideon Pillow.
Yeah. Yes.
And it was to prevent the Northern Flotilla from taking Memphis. But, of course, that was 1862. By 1864, the Yankees controlled the Mississippi River.
Yeah.
There's no reason to have a fort there.
Well, maybe there was another reason that fort was there. What was that?
Money.
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 As in the form of cotton, I bet.
Yes, cotton was called white gold.
Yeah.
The price of cotton before the war was 6 cents a pound. By this time, it was $1.09 a pound.
And back then, that was a real dollar, wasn't it?
That really was. It spikes up to $1.90.
Wow.
They called it white gold
Yes.
because it was worth so much money. And the Union commander at Memphis, General Herbert, was very corrupt. And Fort Pillow was a nice place, out of the way, to funnel contraband cotton through.
So he could conduct his illicit business without spying eyes and make a huge profit, I presume.
Oh, he did, and so did the Union naval people.
Okay, but that is still confusing. I'm sure cotton is no reason to be a chivalrous guy to attack a fort for cotton.
Well, that was the Union objective, was to make money off of cotton.
Yes.
Forrest loved women. He put them on a pedestal.
Now, when you say love, William, you're not talking like in a lustful, evil manner. You're talking about respect.
He did. He did not believe in adultery. As a matter of fact, he fired one of his best friends for having sex outside of marriage.
Wow.
Said, I will not have in my army anybody who would do that to a woman.
Amazing.
But the garrison at Fort Pillow was fairly lawless. And they had raped women and abused them and insulted them. And as Forrest finished his raid in West Tennessee in 1864, at least 2 delegations of women approached him and had private audiences with him and told him of rape and misbehavior. And they asked him to destroy that fort for them. And he said, ladies, I will destroy that fort, even if it costs me my life.
And I read that in your book here, and I was impressed by 2 words in there that when he said that, he said, if it costs me my life. He didn't say, I'll kill all my men. Forrest took that personally, didn't he?
Yes, he did. He could not stand it when women were abused. He protected the innocent.
Wow.
And so the main motive was chivalry. He ordered John Chalmers, told him we're going to clean out that nest of outlaws.
I noticed also in your book that General Gordon, the Yankee general that was in the fort there, he said that the Federals, quote, vented their hatred and lust upon the defenseless Southern women.
Mm-hmm.
Even the Yankees admitted this was going on. So
Yes, they
and
knew it. They just didn't care particularly.
it didn't bother them one way then.
No, it didn't.
Oh, that's a shame.
And that's one reason they put those untrained black soldiers there, because they were former slaves.
Yeah.
And they could pick cotton in an emergency, and that was
Well,
a major cotton region.
And that's another question. How did the Yankees deal with these black troops? Were they well trained, equipped? Did they have good officer corps? What was the status?
They were pitifully ill-equipped, and they were badly trained, if trained at all. During the Battle of Fort Pillow, some of them didn't even have weapons. They had clubs, which were pretty ineffective against forest men who carried six-shooters.
Right.
There was virtually no training. As for equipment, it was supposed to be a heavy artillery battalion, which is usually equipped with at least 18 guns and often 30.
Wow.
They were heavy guns
Yeah.
too, but this black artillery unit, the 6th USCT, United States Colored Troops
Right.
artillery unit, had 4 guns, and they reinforced it with 2 more from the 2nd USCT artillery, giving it a total of 6 guns, and they were light guns.
Hmm.
2 of them were 12-pounders, the others were 6-pounders, which, you know, is no way that's heavy artillery.
No. Well, what about the officers that were leading? Did they have black officers, or who were the officers that were leading these?
They didn't have black officers. They had incompetent white officers. It's the only way they could get promoted. One of them was a man named Lemming, who used the alias Booth. He had reached the rank of sergeant in the white Union regiment there at Vicksburg, but he couldn't get a commission in a white unit, so they made him a major in the USCT, the United States Colored
Right.
Troops. Another one was Bradford, who was a 24-year-old lawyer from Bedford County, Tennessee. He was terribly incompetent. He tried twice to be promoted to colonel, and he took the colonel's test, which was not particularly difficult to pass. He failed it miserably both times. That's why he was only a major commanding a regiment. And so Herbert figured he was incompetent to command the fort, and he sent in a major named Booth. Booth was also pretty incompetent, as you can tell by looking at Fort Pillow, because where they entrenched, it was actually lower than the surrounding hills, which meant the Confederates could control the interior of the fort by fire.
So the fort is not on, doesn't command the high ground.
No, and the only way they could escape was to go across down a single path about 80 feet, which was only 3 feet wide.
Well, now, we talk about the colored troops there. What about white troops there?
Troops,
were they equal number, or what's the difference there?
there was about the same number.
Okay.
It was a Tennessee Tory unit, they called them. They were renegades.
Turncoats, Southern turncoats, what they were.
Well, yeah, and actually 64 of them were deserters from the Confederate Army.
Ah,
And talk about a slaughter, they were put to death.
yes.
Only 17 of them survived, and a lot of them were shot in the back of the head because they were deserters.
Exactly.
Of course, the Confederate soldiers, being Confederate soldiers, they spared them the ordeal of a long trial. They simply shot them.
Deserters, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, listen, right quick, give us just an overview of the battle. What happened there?
Well, Forrest and his men rode, Chalmers Brigade rode basically all night, and they took care of the sentries with their knives. And the fort was, in Forrest's mind, already captured because he had sharpshooters in the hills firing on the interior of the fort. And he called upon the Union commander to surrender. And Major Bradford wouldn't do it. He was obviously stalling for time. And to boost the morale of his troops, to make them fight better, he was foolish enough to make beer and ale and whiskey available.
Now, this is the Yankee commander of the fort.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And you got to remember, blacks in those days were like 1 year away from slavery.
Right.
The typical slave on the typical southern plantation got one shot of whiskey every year. On Christmas Eve, the males, 18 or 21, depending on the master, would line up, and he'd give them one shot of whiskey for Christmas. They had no experience in holding their liquor.
Right.
And 10 o'clock, Forrest had the place surrounded. It's back to the Mississippi River. And he was informed that they were drinking. And Forrest laughed and said, "Fine, we'll give them a chance to get good and drunk." And he also wanted to wait till some artillery wagons appeared with the ammunition. They didn't show up till 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And he launched the attack at 4.
Yeah.
Make
Now,
sure.
if I'm correct on this, some of Forrest's troops did not have enough ammunition. That's one reason he was waiting for the ammo train. Was that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
He waited till they were fully supplied with ammo, and the Union defenders were good and looped,
Yeah. Drunk.
and some were drunk as lords. And then they attacked, and they also made the rebels mad. They told them they made some obscene gestures, said some things.
But when
said
you're
something.
drunk, you'd have a tendency to do stupid things.
Yeah, they said, "Come on, why don't you attack?
Yeah.
That's what you're here for."
How many times did Forrest demand a surrender of the fort? Was
Twice.
it just twice? So
Twice.
so he stuck by. He kept trying to convince them. You're in a hopeless situation. You need to surrender.
Forrest hated to waste lives, and he knew if he attacked, he was going to lose some people. And he did suffer 14 dead,
Yeah.
A casualty rate of 1%.
Yeah.
Of course, the Yankees suffered 50% casualty rates. But he didn't want to do it. He didn't see any sense in it.
What stimulated the Yankee officers to hold out hope that they could fight off this army that was surrounding them, holding the high ground?
Well, they had a scatterbrain plan. They thought if the worst came to worst, they could retreat to the base of the Mississippi River, and they had a Union gunboat there. And they thought the gunboats could hold the rebels off and allow them to escape. Problem was, Forrest wasn't afraid of gunboats, unlike a lot of Confederate commanders were. And he dispatched 400 of his men, 200 on each flank, and their job was to fire into the ports of the gunboats. And you don't have to hit a man in a gunboat.
Because it's all metal in there.
Yeah, because you shoot a bullet through the portal, it's going to bounce around and hurt somebody. And it doesn't really matter if you hit a bolt and it hits the man, or if you hit him with a bullet.
Yeah.
Or if you hit him with a ricochet, it's still going to hurt and probably kill.
And you've got 200 sharpshooters aiming at that porthole, and it's not a small. We think of a porthole you can barely get your head in. We're talking about something that's big enough to roll a big cannon out of.
That's exactly what happened. They came up, they rolled the cannons out. The Confederates started pouring lead into the portals. They rolled the cannons back in and sailed away.
So there went their plan. Okay, Well, continue with the battle then.
Well, Forrest, this was an incredibly poorly designed fort. They had dug a moat, but they could not depress their cannons enough to fire into the moat.
The Yankees holding the fort.
Yeah.
Okay.
Also, there was a gorge, and they could not depress the cannons enough to fire into the gorge. One Union soldier later, I think quite correctly, said, "We made better positions for the rebels than for our own troops."
Right.
So the rebels could not be hit. And they also had 4 lines of barracks. Well, the plan was to burn the barracks if the rebels showed up. Well, they burned one line but didn't burn the other 3, and they could not depress their cannons enough to hit the barracks. So they created sharpshooter positions for the Confederates. It's hard to imagine a battle being conducted worse than this one.
Yes.
Add to that, the Union commander Bradford, as soon as things turned bad, took off
Where do you go?
down the path toward the river. His last words of command were, "Boys, save yourselves." And he took off. And the poor black soldiers were left holding the bag. And they had annoyed Forrest and all the rebels. I told Forrest to do something that I can't repeat here, but it's biologically impossible anyway.
Yes. Okay.
Kind
We can imagine.
Yes, kind of made him mad.
Yeah, right.
And it made the other rebels mad because they thought it was immoral to use black troops anyway
Yeah,
back in
yeah.
those days. So some of them were shot. Not as bad as the Yankee newspaper said, because they came up with all kinds of tales. One of them had a little bit of truth in it. They said they buried the black soldiers alive. Well, yeah, that's just enough truth to make a case for it. One of them did play dead. And quite a few of them played dead, actually. And then when the first wave of rebels passed, they begged for their lives and told the Confederates that they had been conscripted.
Yeah.
And because a lot of the U.S. Colored troops were in the units because they had been forced to be,
Yeah.
the Confederates believed that, and they took them prisoner. Well, one black played dead too long. And some of the Confederates realized, hey, this corpse is breathing. So they decided to try a practical joke. They took him and threw him in the grave and started covering him up with dirt. And he came straight out of the grave, as you can imagine. And the rebels pretended that this was the second resurrection. A miracle. They fell to their knees, and saluted the black Lazarus. They humiliated him, but they didn't kill him.
Yeah. Well, it was all in fun.
And there were some others
Well,
that did shoot.
Okay, then where does the charge of massacre come? They say that Forrest ordered the massacre, Forrest led the massacre. What's the details there?
Well, Forrest, I think, let his troops have their way for about 20 minutes. Before the actual attack, Forrest made a reconnaissance. He always did. But this time he had a horse shot out from under him. He got on another horse, and it was shot out from under him, too. And the third horse he used was wounded, but was not killed. And Forrest was beaten up. He was not a good patient anyway. So he did not personally take part in the actual attack, which was contrary to his usual procedure. So for about 20 minutes, the troops kind of had free rein. The Confederates outnumbered them more than 2-1. The fight lasted about 5 minutes because the blacks were so poorly equipped. They say clubs aren't much use against a six-shooter. And they overran the fort. Most of the actual killings occurred at the base of the river where Forrest was not located. He took the Yankee guns, the cannons, and was trying to shoot the gunboats. He didn't have much luck with it, but that's where he was on top of the bluff. And the killing occurred below the bluff. When Forrest actually at one point ran between his men and some blacks who were trying to surrender.
And he did that to protect the surrender so that they would not be shot? Is that
they were the rebels were ready to shoot them.
Oh, yeah.
Because part of the problem there was those whiskey barrels. The Confederate officers, as soon as they got there, they kicked them over. But some of the enlisted men were quicker than the officers. And
Don't tell me they got their canteen in the whiskey barrel, did
Yeah, the canteen was already full. It's a little late to kick it over. And they were not in the mood to take casualties because they had been antagonized. And, they weren't inclined in that direction anyway. And the Union commander, Bradford, was, terribly incompetent. Booth was shot almost immediately and killed, along with his adjutant. And Bradford took over. And he ran away and then was captured. And then he did everything wrong. Forrest agreed to take him prisoner, even though he held him responsible for the battle. And Bradford gave him his parole, said he would not escape. He took off first thing, dressed in civilian clothes, which is punishable by death, and was recaptured. Forrest intended to take him alive, and Colonel Duckworth was the commander of the 7th Tennessee there. He sent in a lieutenant and 4 men to carry him to prison. But the lieutenant had his own agenda, and they found Bradford's body a year after the war in the woods with a couple of bullet holes in the back of his neck. So the Confederates took care of him.
Yeah.
But that basically is the story of the massacre. The massacre was reported on a week later by a Union reporter in Knoxville, Tennessee, on the other side of the state, and was mostly fictitious. But the Lincoln administration needed cover because Forrest had become a bugaboo to Union soldiers by that point. Confederate civilians were actually threatening the Union soldiers with General Forrest. If they insulted a woman, she would say, "I'm going to tell General Forrest on you." And the Union troops had begun to believe it because Forrest had won some incredible victories. And it was kind of like the Desert Fox myth in World War II. The British were under Cal to Irwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. Well, the Union soldiers were the same way vis-a-vis General Forrest. And Lincoln wanted to minimize his psychological effect on the Union forces. Also, he made 40,000 copies of this bogus investigation they had. Two of the eyewitnesses were actually in Memphis when the battle was fought, for example. And of course, there were no Confederate witnesses, and they made 40,000 copies of it and sent to Union newspapers to influence the election on behalf of President Lincoln.
Now, I heard that Sherman had investigated, and William Sherman is no friend of Forrest. What did Sherman say about this?
Sherman said nothing. He didn't believe the congressional report. He had his own investigation done by his own officers. If they'd found anything, there would have been reprisal. Yeah. Sherman was not afraid of a reprisal.
Yeah.
But he got the report and didn't do a thing, which suggests we don't have a copy of that report.
Yeah.
It was probably destroyed, but it suggests that the congressional probe was a lie.
Yeah. Okay. So actually, since Forrest was such a hero and he was causing a lot of trouble with the federal troops in the area, he had to be destroyed one way or the other. They couldn't defeat him militarily. Psychologically, they was hoping to defeat him.
And they were hoping to minimize his importance that way. All right. I don't know if they succeeded or not. I think they did to a small degree.
All right, what I take from this is, number one, there was no massacre in the military sense at Fort Pillow. There were atrocities committed, but remember, atrocities are committed on both sides. This is a war, and it was a so-called civil war. It was bloody, it was messy, it was some atrocities. Number two, Forrest didn't order the atrocities, and he did intervene in the latter stages to prevent. And I read in your book that he treated all his prisoners, black or white, with respect. And they were sent on to prison and actually were not returned to slavery. The slaves were ex-slaves. So it sounds to me like it's a different Forrest than what we normally hear about when we talk about the so-called massacre at Fort Pillow.
That's true, it was. As a matter of fact, there was a truce after the battle, and Forrest gave the Union prisoners who were badly wounded back to a Union transport, and 17 of those were blacks.
How about that?
Matter of fact, it's one of history's ironies. The blacks came out better than the whites as prisoners.
Yes.
Because the blacks were put into labor battalions. Now, that's not a walk in the park.
Right.
But you do get fed. It may not be anything but beans and rice, but you can live on it.
Right.
And the end of slavery was a year away, so they would eventually be free. The white Union prisoners were sent to Andersonville, which is a much worse deal, as you know.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Mitchum, I appreciate you being with us, and I hope this opens the door to some information that people have not seen. And I still stress, if anybody wants to know something about General Forrest, this is a book that I recommend. It is excellent, a good read, a fun read, and a very knowledgeable read. Dr. Mitchum, we appreciate you being here, and we really appreciate your book, Bust Hell Wide Open, The Life of Nathan Bedford Forrest. And I'm Walter D. Donnie Kennedy, Chief of Heritage Operation for the Sons of Confederate Veterans, and I hope you've enjoyed our little program. Thank you.